Sudan, the return of genocide. How a new civil war became an ethnic massacre, and why the world still hesitates while millions die. Executive summary. Short since April 2023, Sudan's civil war has morphed into a campaign of mass atrocity in Darfur and other regions. Evidence collected by journalists, NGOs, the United Nations, and the International Criminal Court shows deliberate, targeted killings, summary executions, attacks on hospitals and displacement camps, and sieges that have provoked famine and epidemics. In January 2025, the United States concluded that the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, and allied militias had committed genocide, a determination supported by mounting satellite, witness, and medical evidence. Despite sanctions, ICC interest, and growing documentation, life-saving access is chronically insufficient, and the violence continues, with El Fasher's fall in late 2025 marking a new, horrific escalation. Immediate international action is required to stop mass murder, secure humanitarian relief, and begin accountability processes. 1. The scene: famine, mass graves, burning camps. When the Rapid Support Forces swept into El Fasher in October 2025, satellite analysts and local medics saw patterns that recalled Darfur's darkest days. Satellite imagery showed clusters consistent in size and shading with human bodies and wide areas of red discoloration across open ground. Videos posted to social media, authenticated by human rights investigators, depicted extrajudicial killings, corpses in streets, and crowds fleeing under drone and artillery fire. Medical teams arriving after the RSF advance describe hospitals looted and patients shot where they lay. The images and testimony are neither isolated nor accidental. They fit into a broader pattern of attacks on civilians that international institutions now treat as potential genocide. For civilians, the cost is immediate and unimaginably brutal. Reports from humanitarian agencies and domestic medical networks describing attacks on civilian shelters, marketplaces, and displacement camps show hundreds killed in single incidents. Thousands more are trapped in besieged cities with dwindling food, water, and medicine. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, and famine review panels have confirmed famine conditions in multiple urban areas, with acute hunger intensifying as sieges and blockades prevent relief. 2. How we got here. From post-coup instability to open atrocity. Sudan's 2023 eruption began as a horrific political confrontation between two armed forces that had once been allied: the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF. The RSF, whose leadership evolved from the Janjaweed militias implicated in the first Darfur genocide 2 decades earlier, turned a power struggle into an explicit war for control of the state's future. Once fighting spread, the dynamics of identity and revenge quickly overlaid military objectives. Where fighting became most intense, attacks on non-Arab communities intensified, sometimes indistinguishable from organized ethnic cleansing. Within months, the conflict ceased to be a contest for palaces and became a war on civilians. Sieges of towns, targeted raids on camps for internally displaced people, IDPs, shelling of markets and mosques, and the deliberate denial of food and medicines. Large population movements, nearly 10 million internally displaced, and many millions more as refugees across borders, turned humanitarian operations into a desperate scramble. The arithmetic of the crisis is simple and unforgiving. When medical care stops, siege removes food and water, and violent actors target those trying to flee, famine, disease, and mass death soon follow. 3. The evidence, patterns, places, perpetrators. 3.1 Concentration of violence. Darfur, El Fasher, Kordofan, and Khartoum peripheries. The areas where patterns are clearest are the Darfur states, particularly El Fasher, North Darfur, and parts of Kordofan and Greater Khartoum. Repeated independently corroborated reports document strikingly similar tactics. RSF forces and allied militias attack civilian neighborhoods and IDP camps with artillery and drones, then sweep through with small arms, executing men and boys and committing sexual violence against women and girls. Multiple organizations have cataloged these actions using OSINT open-source intelligence, satellite imagery, and on-the-ground testimonies. 3.2 Siege warfare and manufactured famine. One central method has been siege. In cities like El Fasher and Kadugli, besieging forces cut off access to food, water, and medical supplies. The result is starvation within embattled urban enclosures. The IPC and famine review panels, after detailed local assessment, have confirmed Phase 5 famine conditions in multiple locations. Famine in a city under siege is not a side effect. It is often, by design, a weapon of war. 3.3 Targeting of medical facilities, aid workers, and displaced people. Humanitarian workers report an appalling pattern. Hospitals and clinics struck by drones or artillery. Ambulances denied safe passage. Shelters and displacement camps shelled and burned. Aid organizations and Sudanese health networks have documented mass civilian casualties at hospitals and in shelters that were explicitly targeted or overrun. The destruction of medical capacity multiplies death from wounds, malnutrition, and disease. 3.4 Ethnic selection and intent. The U.S. determination of genocide in January 2025 emphasized a critical legal element: intent. Secretary of State Antony Blinken concluded that RSF and allied militias were systematically killing civilians, particularly men and boys, on the basis of ethnicity, and preventing civilians from accessing supplies, acts consistent with genocidal intent when evaluated collectively. The evidence of target selection, who was rounded up, who was executed, who was prevented from escaping, is a linchpin of that determination. 4. Voices, survivors, medics, and witnesses. The pattern emerges not only in satellite pixels and NGO reports, but in the human testimony of survivors and medics. A health worker who fled El Fasher described bodies piling up in hospital courtyards, families refusing to bury members because it was too dangerous, and the harrowing knowledge that even children were being executed when soldiers decided men were too many to feed. That a displaced mother from North Darfur recounted being forced from her home, watching men taken away in trucks, the sound of gunfire every night, and aid convoys that never arrived. Journalists and human rights monitors who made it to Tooele and nearby towns reported survivors who described house-to-house killings and mosques turned into slaughter sites. These testimonies establish both scale and intention. They are not isolated crimes of opportunity, but a pattern of deliberate actions directed against identifiable communities. 5. The legal framing, genocide, crimes against humanity, and the ICC 5.1 What is genocide, and why the label matters. Under the 1948 Genocide Convention, genocide means acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. That includes killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions intended to bring about the group's physical destruction, imposing measures to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children. The gravamen here is intent, proving it is difficult, but possible when practices show consistent targeting of a protected group. The U.S. determination that RSF activities constitute genocide is therefore both symbolic and legally consequential. It signals a political judgment about the nature of the crimes and can guide sanctions, referrals, and advocacy for international enforcement. It also sets a standard for other states and institutions to consider whether to act under the Genocide Convention's obligations. 5.2 ICC Involvement and Evidence Preservation. The International Criminal Court, ICC, has a pre-existing investigative mandate regarding Darfur dating to the 2000s, and in 2025 took immediate steps to preserve evidence regarding alleged mass killings in El Fasher and other sites. ICC prosecutors are collecting satellite imagery, social media videos, medical records, witness statements, and other forensic materials, and have issued public statements indicating that allegations include war crimes, crimes against humanity, and potentially genocide. The ICC's work is challenged by access and security constraints, but it is critical. Accountability at the international level requires meticulous evidence building and witness protection. 5.3 National Accountability and the Politics of Arrest. Even with ICC interest, effective accountability requires arrests and trials. That depends on political platforms and cooperation from states where suspects may travel. Many of the RSF's leadership and irregular commanders maintain regional support networks and private sponsorships. Without pressure, suspects remain beyond the reach of courts. With pressure and creative diplomacy, targeted sanctions, travel bans, and asset freezes, international bodies can increase legal risk to perpetrators and reduce their freedom to operate. 6. The humanitarian calculus. Numbers, disease, and famine. 6.1 The scale of displacement and deaths. Humanitarian monitoring groups estimate millions uprooted. Close to 10 to 12 million people displaced internally and externally since the conflict escalated, with entire towns emptied and refugee flows destabilizing neighboring countries. Exact death tolls in protracted conflict are hard to confirm, but the UN, local medical groups, and NGOs have reported tens of thousands of violent deaths, and many more from famine and disease. The consequence is a stacked humanitarian crisis: conflict casualties, acute malnutrition, epidemics, and a collapsing health system. 6.2 Cholera, measles, and collapsing health systems. War, displacement, and collapsed sanitation have driven disease outbreaks. Sudan has suffered a major cholera epidemic and other preventable diseases that spread faster in overcrowded camps and besieged cities, with no clean water. The result is staggering morbidity and mortality on top of direct, violent deaths. Without sustained humanitarian access and restoration of basic services, death rates from disease will continue to climb. 6.3 Famine confirmation and the human consequences. IPC and famine review committees have confirmed famine in El Fasher and Kadugli and warned of expanding Phase 5 conditions in other besieged localities. Famine confirmation is based on careful measurement of food availability, mortality rates, coping strategies, and market collapse. It is not invoked lightly. Famine means a large share of the population is already dying or facing imminent death by starvation. The imagery of hunger, children with swollen bellies, trucks turned back by armed checkpoints, families eating leaves, is the daily reality for many. 7. The geopolitics, sponsors, arms flows, and regional complicity. The conflict's intensity has been amplified by external actors. Reports and investigative journalism have exposed networks of arms flows, the involvement of regional powers, and commercial transactions that sustain the RSF's capabilities. Some states have been accused, in diplomatic cables and media reports, of providing material support, allowing logistics hubs, or tacitly enabling the RSF for geopolitical reasons. These external relationships must be understood. They turn a domestic atrocity into a proxy-fueled catastrophe, complicating international pressure and rendering diplomatic solutions more fraught. Sanctions imposed by the U.S. and other states target RSF leaders and affiliated commercial networks. Sanctions are necessary, but insufficient on their own. Enforcement requires international coordination to close loopholes, freeze assets, and choke supply lines used for drones, ammunition, and heavy weapons that have multiplied civilian suffering. 8. Why the world hesitates. Legal, political, and moral barriers. 8.1 Risk of escalation and limits of military options. One stark reason for international caution is the risk of wider regional escalation. Sudan shares borders with volatile states, and foreign intervention without a broad consensus risks drawing in neighboring militaries or turning the conflict into a broader regional war. Moreover, ground intervention to protect civilians raises tremendous logistical, political, and moral questions. Who would spearhead it, under what mandate, and at what cost? These are stark constraints on direct use of force. 8.2 Realpolitik and competing interests. States often balance moral outrage with strategic self-interest. Some countries value influence in Sudan for trade, oil, migration control, or regional alliances, and thus hesitate to isolate actors who provide them advantage. This Realpolitik complicates unified action. When geopolitical rivalry or regional ambitions are at stake, achieving the international consensus needed for forceful measures or even effective sanctions becomes difficult. 8.3 Humanitarian access versus security. Humanitarian organizations face a brutal choice. To deliver aid, they must negotiate with all parties to the conflict, sometimes including groups implicated in atrocities. Negotiating access can appear to legitimize perpetrators. refusing access can let civilians die. The result is chronic under-resourcing. Aid convoys are attacked, warehouses looted, and agencies forced to scale back operations. The practical consequence is that even when donors pledge millions, getting life-saving assistance to starving people remains an almost impossible bureaucratic and security challenge. 9. What justice looks like. Steps toward accountability. 9.1 Preserve evidence and protect witnesses. The ICC's immediate steps to secure evidence in El Fasher are crucial. Evidence: satellite images, videos, hospital logs, burial records, witness statements must be collected rapidly and securely. Witnesses and survivors must be protected with relocation options, anonymity in trials when necessary, and psychosocial support to enable testimony without reprisal. Without evidence preservation, prosecutions will be impossible in the years to come. 9.2 Use sanctions and diplomatic isolation strategically. Sanctions targeted at RSF leaders, their commercial networks, and foreign enablers can increase legal and financial costs for perpetrators. Travel bans, asset freezes, and designations that restrict procurement of drones and heavy arms reduce capacity. Crucially, sanctions must be coordinated globally to avoid easy workarounds. The U.S. sanctions and public genocide determination set precedents. The challenge is to multiply and enforce those measures internationally. 9.3 Support national and hybrid prosecutions. While the ICC is essential, national courts in neighboring states and hybrid tribunals, combining international and domestic law and personnel, can accelerate accountability if empowered. Training local prosecutors, offering legal resources, and establishing universal jurisdiction cases in third-party countries for certain crimes can widen the accountability net. History shows that multiple complementary venues increase the chance that perpetrators are arrested and tried. 10. Humanitarian priorities. How to stop the dying right now. Stopping killing and starvation today requires a focused humanitarian and diplomatic push. Immediate ceasefire zones and humanitarian corridors, negotiated and enforced via international monitors, UN, AU, or a coalition. Safe corridors must be protected by credible deterrents, including the threat of sanctions for violators. Unimpeded delivery of food, medicine, and fuel. Lessons from Syria and Yemen show that prepositioning supplies and using neutral ground for distribution reduces looting and delays. Humanitarian logistics must be insulated from political bargaining. Emergency evacuations for the most vulnerable. Children with severe malnutrition, pregnant women, and the wounded need rapid evacuation to functioning hospitals outside besieged zones. Scale up funding with fast disbursement. Donors must provide funds with fewer bureaucratic constraints. Money that arrives slowly cannot save lives in fast-moving famine contexts. Protect medical and humanitarian infrastructure. Attacks on hospitals must be publicly documented and lead to immediate sanctions and referrals to international legal bodies. These are not theoretical items. They are the practical actions that prevent death. Delay equals more funerals. 11. The human cost. Stories that must be heard. Selected, anonymized testimony aggregated from NGO reports, interviews, and field dispatches. They put the men in a line beside the school and shot them. I tried to run with my baby. They threw grenades. We buried the father under the school stairs. I will never sleep again. Woman from a North Darfur village. We fled to the market to find food. The market was hit with a missile. My sister was pregnant. We lost everything. We are eating one meal a day, sometimes none. Displaced family in Tawila. We chased the ambulance away. We had to bury our colleague. The hospital was burned. They called it cleansing. A medic who left El Fasher. These voices are the moral core of the crisis. They show not abstract numbers, but shattered lives. 12. Risks of inaction. What follows if the world stays silent? If the international community fails to act with urgency, genocide will become entrenched. Once genocidal practices are normalized, removals, summary executions, forced starvation, they are extremely difficult to reverse. Regional destabilization will intensify. Refugee flows will strain fragile neighbors. Armed groups will find safe havens across porous borders. The ICC and justice architecture will be weakened. If the world documents genocide but does not secure arrests, impunity becomes the pattern for future atrocities. Global moral authority will fracture. Never again will be exposed as hollow if early, unequivocal intervention is not attempted when warnings turn dire. 13. Concrete policy recommendations, short list. Internationally coordinated sanctions against RSF leaders and enablers, with enforcement mechanisms to close loopholes. ICC Evidence Support Fund. Immediate funding and technical assistance to preserve forensics, satellite data, and witness testimony. Humanitarian ceasefire and protected corridors brokered by a coalition with leverage. UN-AU key regional states, backed by sanctions for violations. Emergency humanitarian air bridge and convoy. Security guarantees for besieged cities, El Fasher, Kadugli. Refugee protection and resettlement support for neighboring states, combined with robust anti-trafficking measures for fleeing women and children. 14. The moral question. Can we act? And do we deserve to be called we? The world has a duty not only under law, but under conscience. When instruments of the state are transformed into instruments of ethnic destruction, the global community has a choice: to respond with decisive protection and accountability measures, or to let millions die in a slow, bureaucratic silence. We have seen too many times how slow, incremental responses fail. From Rwanda to Srebrenica to parts of Syria, delays cost lives and embolden perpetrators. The lessons are known. The political must follow. 15. Conclusion. The test of our time. Sudan is not simply a faraway headline. It is a current moral test for international institutions, regional powers, and donor countries. The evidence gathered by the UN, human rights groups, satellite labs, and journalists indicates that mass atrocities in Darfur and elsewhere are not isolated crimes, but systematic practices that qualify for the gravest legal label: genocide. Words alone will not suffice. Declarations of genocide and ICC interest are crucial, but inadequate unless matched by immediate humanitarian operations, enforcement of sanctions, protection of witnesses, and a serious plan for legal accountability. The clock is unforgiving. Each day without food convoys, each hospital destroyed, each detention and summary execution hardens the pattern we call genocide. The moment to act was yesterday. The moment to act remains now.